Jack put the phone face up on the table between them. Nam looked at it, then he looked away, then he looked back, because the kind of man who looks away from evidence is also the kind of man who cannot stop looking at it. That is a transfer record, Jack said. Dated 6 weeks before your daughter was born, from your mother's account to a lawyer in the city. The lawyer specializes in one thing. Jack paused. Custody disputes involving inheritance claims. The room was small, a tea shop at the edge of the market, chosen because it was public and because Jack had learned, in the past month, that certain conversations needed witnesses even when no one was listening. Nam sat across from him with both hands flat on the table. He was wearing the same dark shirt he had worn the day Jack brought Let home. He had not shaved. You don't understand how my family works, Nam said. I understand exactly how your family works. Jack's voice did not rise. It never rose in these conversations. He had learned that stillness was sharper than volume. Your mother found out 3 months ago that Let's biological family exists, that there is land on that mountain, that there is an old woman with no other living descendants except Ly and the child she is carrying. He picked up the phone, put it back in his pocket. Your mother was not keeping Ly. She was keeping the baby. Nam's jaw moved. He said nothing. The lawyer has already been contacted by our side, Jack said. There is no case. Let is the mother. The child has no registered father because you did not sign the birth documents at the hospital. That was your choice. It is now also your consequence. She is still my wife. She was your wife when you kicked her out of your house at 5 months pregnant because the doctor told you the baby was a girl. Jack stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward. He just stood, the way a person stands when a conversation is over and they are simply waiting for the other person to understand that. The papers were filed this morning. You will receive a copy by end of week. I would recommend you speak to your mother before she speaks to the lawyer again, because the second conversation will cost significantly more than the first. Nam looked up at him. For a moment, something moved across his face, not remorse, not exactly, but the shadow of a man who had once been capable of it and had chosen, over and over, not to be. Who are you? Nam said. To her. Who are you? Jack picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Nobody, he said. I am nobody to her. That is exactly why I can do this, and you cannot. He walked out. The drive back to the farm took 20 minutes. Jack drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The rice fields on either side of the road were very green from the recent rain. A water buffalo stood in the middle of a paddy and watched the truck pass with the particular expression of animals that have decided the world is mostly not their problem. His phone rang once. Uncle Doong. It's done, Jack said. A pause on the other end. How did he take it? The way those men always take it. He sat there and waited for someone to tell him it wasn't his fault. And you? I didn't tell him that. Another pause. Come back for lunch. Tu Tien made soup. Jack almost smiled. Yes, back. Tu Tien had found the cradle at the back of Bac Doong's storage room. It was older than she had expected, the wood darkened and smooth from years of handling. She had asked Bac Doong about it, and he had gone quiet for a moment and said only that it had been his sister's, a long time ago, and that it had been waiting for someone to need it. She had carried it out to the small room at the end of the farmhouse, the one that had been a storage room until 3 days ago, when she and Mrs. Ly had quietly moved everything out, swept the floor twice, and stood in the empty space looking at each other without saying what they were both thinking. Now Tu Tien knelt on the floor with a cloth and a small jar of beeswax and worked the old wood back to something close to what it had once been. The grain came up under the cloth, The room smelled of beeswax and dried wood, and the particular clean smell of a space that has been recently aired. Mrs. Ly came in and stood in the doorway. "The mattress is too thin," she said. "I folded 2 layers. Still too thin. Mom, I will go to the market tomorrow and buy proper padding." Mrs. Ly stepped into the room. She looked at the cradle. Her face did something complicated that she did not try to hide. "My mother had one like this. Before the flood took everything." Tu Tien kept working. She had learned, with Mrs. Ly, that the best response to certain sentences was to keep doing the thing you were doing and let the sentence breathe. "Did Jack call?" Mrs. Ly asked. 20 minutes ago." "It's done." Mrs. Ly exhaled. One long breath, the kind that has been held for several days. "And the lawyer?" "Filed this morning. Nam has no claim. His mother has no claim." Tu Tien set down the cloth. She looked at the cradle, at the grain of the old wood, at the shape worn smooth by years of a different family's love. "Let doesn't know yet. Jack wants to tell her in person." Mrs. Ly nodded. She came and knelt beside Tu Tien on the floor, which took effort. Her knees were not what they had been, and picked up the second cloth without being asked. They worked side by side in the small room, the two of them, in the particular silence of women who are building something together and do not need to name what it is. Jack told Ly at the hospital the following afternoon. He sat in the chair beside her bed. The baby was asleep in the bassinet beside her, 4 days old, very small, with a faint dark fuzz of hair, and the amber gold eyes that had made an old woman on a mountain stop walking 3 months ago. Ly listened without interrupting. She held the baby's hand, one finger hooked around the baby's whole fist, and she listened to every word Jack said, and she did not cry, which Jack had learned by now meant she was feeling something too large for crying. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "He won't come," she said finally. "Not a question." "No." "And his mother?" "No." Ly looked at her daughter. The baby's fist tightened slightly around her finger in sleep, the involuntary grip of newborns, holding on without knowing they are holding on. "I thought I would feel more," Ly said quietly, "when it was really over. I thought it would feel like something falling away." She paused. "It just feels like quiet." "Quiet is enough," Jack said, "for now." Ly looked at him. "You didn't have to do this." "I know. Why did you?" Jack looked at the baby, at the amber eyes closed in sleep, at the fist around Ly's finger. "Because nobody did it for someone I once knew," he said. "And I have thought about that for a long time." Ly did not ask who. She simply nodded, the way she nodded when she understood something that went deeper than explanation. They brought her home on a Thursday morning. The sky was clear. Baek Dung had driven down to the hospital himself, in the good truck, the one he usually only used for market days. He had put a folded blanket on the back seat without being asked. He had also, at some point in the night, hung a small bundle of dried herbs above the door of the small room, the kind of thing country people do when a new life enters a house for the first time. Mrs. Ly was waiting at the gate. She had been there for an hour before the truck arrived. Tu Tien knew because she had checked twice, and both times Mrs. Ly had been standing at the gate in her good blouse, the lime green one with the flower brooch, with her hands folded and her face turned toward the road. The truck came through the gate slowly. Ly stepped out, one hand on the door, the other holding the baby against her chest in the wrap Tu Tien had shown her how to tie 3 days ago at the hospital. The baby was awake. The amber eyes were open and unfocused and calm, the way newborn eyes are when the world is still just light and warmth and the sound of a heartbeat. Mrs. Ly walked forward. She did not say anything. She just put both hands out, palms up, in the wordless gesture that means the same thing in every language: "Let me hold her." Ly placed the baby in Mrs. Ly's arms. Mrs. Ly looked down at the child, at the amber eyes, at the dark fuzz of hair, at the fist curled against the blanket. "Hello," she said softly. "To the baby, not to anyone else. We have been waiting for you." Bak Dung had turned away. He was looking at something very interesting in the rice field to his left, and his shoulders were doing the thing shoulders do when a person is trying very hard not to show their face. Jack stood beside Tu Tien near the farmhouse door. Tu Tien had her arms crossed against the morning air. Her eyes were bright. "Go ahead," Jack said quietly. "I'm not crying. I know, go ahead anyway." She laughed a small wet sound and pressed her face briefly against his shoulder. Inside the small room, Let laid the baby in the cradle for the first time. The old wood held. The beeswax made it smell like something good and old and permanent. Tu Tien had lined the bottom with soft cloth. Mrs. Loe's new padding was under that. Above the cradle, Bak Dung's dried herbs moved slightly in the air from the open window. Let stood over the cradle and looked at her daughter for a long time. Then she saw it. Tucked into the corner of the cradle lining folded small, the size of a matchbox was a piece of cloth. Old, faded, a plaid pattern in green and purple and pink and teal, the colors washed soft by years of sun and washing. The same pattern as the scarf Lei wore every day. The same pattern as the scarf the old woman on the mountain had been wearing when she stopped walking and said a name that was not Lei's name. Lei picked it up, her hands were shaking. Inside the folded cloth was a single dried frangipani flower, white, almost weightless, and a small piece of paper, folded twice, with 3 words written in a hand Let had never seen before, but recognized immediately the way you recognize something that was always yours. "Come home soon." Let sat down on the floor of the small room. She held the cloth against her chest. The baby made a small sound in the cradle, not crying, just announcing herself, the way new people do when they arrive somewhere and want to be known. In the doorway, Tu Tien stopped. She had come to check. She saw Let on the floor, the cloth in her hands, the piece of paper. She did not go in. She stood in the doorway and did not make a sound. And Jack, passing behind her in the corridor, saw Tu Tien's face, saw what was in it and stopped too. He looked past her into the small room, at Lei on the floor, at the cloth, at the baby in the cradle reaching one small fist toward the ceiling as if testing whether the world was solid. His phone was in his pocket. The message from H was still there, unanswered. "I know who the father is. We need to talk before she leaves that hospital." She had already left. The conversation was already overdue. Jack took out his phone. He typed one line, "Tell me where."